An old man knelt in a Beijing greenhouse, thinning seedlings for a state wage. That afternoon, tourists queued outside a walled palace across the city. He had owned it. Every roof, every gate, every eunuch on the payroll. Reportedly, to go back in, he bought a ticket. He is not the strangest case here. A sultan left his empire before dawn in a British ambulance. A queen signed her kingdom away under guard, one floor above her throne room. Losing a crown is common. These 10 lost the country underneath it, and most never knew which morning was the last. One rule before the countdown, because it decides who qualifies. A country dying is not the same as a government changing. France stopped having kings and stayed France. Egypt threw out Farouk and is still Egypt. Every state on this list was dissolved, annexed, renamed, or wiped off the map while the last ruler was alive to watch it happen. Number 10 spent his final morning as sultan, lying in the back of a British ambulance, in the rain, before 6. Mehmed VI was the 36th ruler of the House of Osman. His palace was Dolma Bahçe, marble on the edge of the Bosphorus, with a chandelier in the throne room heavy enough to need its own engineering. Every Friday he rode out to prayer while crowds watched. His signature, the Tugra, was drawn as a design so that people who could not read still recognized authority. It sat on coins, on mosque gates, on every state paper in the empire. He was also caliph, which meant Muslims in India and Central Asia wrote him letters he had no power to answer. That was the surface. Underneath, the empire had lost the war, and Istanbul was under Allied occupation. Real power had moved 350 miles east to Ankara, where a nationalist assembly ran a rival government, and a war it was winning. His ministers signed the Treaty of Sèvres, which carved the country up. Ankara refused it and beat the Greek army anyway. After that, the assembly did not need a sultan to look legitimate, so it voted him out of existence. On the 1st of November 1922, the Grand National Assembly separated the sultanate from the caliphate and abolished the sultanate. No siege, no storming of gates, a show of hands in a building he had never entered. Here is the part people forget. He did not flee a mob. He asked the occupying army he had failed to resist for a lift out. On the 17th of November, he boarded HMS Malaya with a small party and very little luggage. Malta, then the Hejaz, then a rented life in San Remo, Italy, where he died in May 1926. He was buried in Damascus at the Sultan Selim Mosque, in a city his family had ruled for 4 centuries and which by then was run by France. 600 years of empire ended with a man asking foreigners for a ride. He at least knew he was leaving. The next one found out he was finished from a press announcement. Wilhelm II learned he was no longer emperor because his own chancellor announced the abdication without asking him. Look at what he had. Supreme warlord of the German Empire. Uniforms in such quantity that foreign newspapers made jokes about it. Castles, hunting estates, a yacht, and a navy built for the single purpose of frightening Britain. His face on the stamps, his portrait on classroom walls from the Rhine to East Prussia. The crack was that by 1918, he was decoration. The war was being run by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, and when the front broke, Ludendorff resigned and handed the wreckage to civilian politicians. Sailors mutinied at Kiel. Councils of workers and soldiers took over cities. On the 9th of November, Chancellor Max von Baden simply announced that the Kaiser had abdicated, which he had not, and a republic was proclaimed from a Reichstag balcony that afternoon. When Wilhelm asked whether the army would march with him, his own generals said no. He crossed into the neutral Netherlands the next day. The signed abdication came weeks later, on the 28th, when it was a formality nobody was waiting for. The Allies demanded him for trial. The Dutch refused to hand him over, and in 1920 he bought a manor house at Doorn. Dozens of railway wagons of furniture and possessions came out of Germany after him, which tells you exactly what he thought exile was going to be. Temporary, comfortable, short. He chopped wood. He wrote memoirs blaming everyone else. He kept the household running on court protocol, guests still formally presented to him, in a country with no interest in any of it. He died at Doorn in June 1941, while German troops occupied the Netherlands. He left instructions that his body stay there until the monarchy was restored. It has been 85 years. He is still in the Garden Mausoleum, waiting. Wilhelm got 22 years of exile. Number 8 got 3.5. Charles I of Austria never abdicated. That detail is the whole story. He inherited 2 crowns in 1916, in the middle of a war he did not start. Vienna gave him Schönbrunn and its 1,200 rooms, and a court so precisely ranked that the rules covered which staircase a person of which title could use. Budapest gave him a separate coronation and a separate parliament. His army marched under one double-headed eagle in more than a dozen languages. That was also the weakness. Austria-Hungary was a family, not a nation. No common language, no common church. The only thing holding 50 million people together was the Habsburgs, and 4 years of war had emptied the treasury and turned every ethnic grievance into a political program with foreign backing. His secret attempt at a separate peace leaked, humiliated him in front of Berlin, and left both sides treating him as unreliable. On the 11th of November 1918, he signed a declaration renouncing participation in the affairs of state. He chose that wording carefully. He did not abdicate because he intended to come back. The Austrian Republic answered in April 1919 with the Habsburg Law. Exile, titles gone, family property confiscated. A statute did what no army had managed. He tried twice in 1921 to take back the Hungarian throne. Both attempts failed. The second ended with Allied warships and a one-way trip to Madeira. There he lived in borrowed rooms with a wife and 7 children and almost no money. He caught a cold walking into town in winter, developed pneumonia, and died on the 1st of April 1922. He was 34. The Capuchin crypt in Vienna holds 150 years of his family. His place in it is empty. He is on an island in the Atlantic, in a church at Monte, where people still leave flowers. The Catholic Church beatified him in 2004, which makes him the only Habsburg to fail completely as an emperor and be honored for it as a man. His widow, Zita, wore black for 67 years. Those 3 lost empires that were already dying. The next man lost a country that was killed while he stood in it. Peter II was 11 when his father was assassinated in Marseille, and he became king of Yugoslavia. He was 17 when officers staged a coup in his name, declared him of age, and put a teenager in charge of a state that had existed for 23 years. On paper, it looked solid. The royal palace at Dedinje, a crown stitched together after 1918 out of Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and Montenegrins, British royal godparents, an army of 1 million men, on paper. The problem was that the people inside it did not agree it should exist. The Regency had signed the Tripartite Pact to stay out of the war. Belgrade rioted. The coup followed. 11 days later, German bombers were over the capital, and the army of 1 million men collapsed in 11 days. He ran. Greece, then Jerusalem, then Cairo, then London. And here the story turns, because the thing that finished him was not the invasion. By 1944, Britain and the United States had worked out that Tito's partisans were killing more Germans than his officers were, and they switched. His own allies retired him. In November 1945, a constituent assembly in Belgrade abolished the monarchy while he sat in London, 22 years old and in perfect health. He signed nothing. 2 years later, they took his citizenship. What happened after is the part that gets left out. He went to the United States and tried business and public relations work, mostly without success. He struggled with money and with drinking. He died in Denver in November 1970, aged 47, following a liver transplant. They buried him at a Serbian monastery in Libertyville, Illinois, which spent decades quietly functioning as the mausoleum of a European king in the American Midwest. He got home in 2013, 43 years dead. By then, Yugoslavia had disappeared a second time, and the country printed in his old passport did not exist in either version of itself. He lost his country to allies who found somebody better. Number 6 lost hers in a negotiation she was not invited to. Ranavalona III was Queen of Madagascar, which most people do not realize was a recognized sovereign state that signed treaties with Britain and the United States. Her capital sat on a hill called the Rova, a walled compound of royal tombs and palaces, including the wooden palace of an earlier queen encased in stone. She had a court aristocracy, a state church, and a prime minister who was also her husband by government arrangement. Her security rested on one thing. Britain and France both wanted the island, and neither would let the other have it. In 1890, Britain traded its interest away in exchange for French acceptance of British claims elsewhere. Nobody consulted her. She lost her protection in a room in Europe. France declared a protectorate. She resisted. In 1895, French troops marched on the capital, shelled the palace, and took her surrender. Then came the clever part. They left her on the throne and governed through her. It worked until a rebellion broke out, and General Gallieni decided a queen was no longer a useful instrument, but a live risk. France annexed the island in 1896. In 1897, Gallieni abolished the monarchy and deported her. A dynasty ended by administrative order, signed by a general. She went to Ryukyuan, then to Algiers. Here is the detail that makes it worse. France paid her. She had an allowance, a comfortable house, and permission to visit Paris, where she attended events in European dress and was photographed as a curiosity. A queen without a kingdom, funded by the government that had taken it. She was not punished. She was made harmless. She petitioned for years to go home. She was never allowed. She died in Algiers in May 1917. Her remains were finally returned in 1938 and placed in the royal tombs. In 1995, the Rova burned. The hill she had ruled from went up in a single night. Both queens were kept on the payroll of the powers that removed them. Only one of them saw an apology, and it took 76 years. Liliuokalani signed away the Kingdom of Hawaii in a room inside her own palace, under arrest, one floor above the throne room. Iolani Palace had electric light before the White House did. There was a throne room, a royal band, a crown ordered from London, legations abroad, and treaties with the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and Japan. The Queen herself was a published composer. Underneath, sugar had bought the country. American planters controlled the capital and, through a constitution forced on her brother, most of the machinery of government. The native Hawaiian population had been collapsing for a century under introduced disease, which hollowed out the base the monarchy stood on. When she moved to restore royal authority with a new constitution in January 1893, the planters formed a committee and the American minister landed Marines from the USS Boston. She then did something unusual. She surrendered not to the rebels, but to the United States, in writing, expecting Washington to review the case and reverse it. Washington did review it. President Cleveland's investigator concluded the overthrow had been wrong. Congress did nothing. The planters declared a republic instead. Then came two documents. In 1895, after a failed royalist rising, she was imprisoned upstairs in her own palace and signed an abdication. In 1898, the United States annexed Hawaii by joint resolution of Congress because an annexation treaty could not get the votes in the Senate, a country absorbed through a procedural shortcut. She spent her last years traveling to Washington, filing claims for the Crown lands, and living on a modest pension from the territorial legislature. She died in 1917. Her palace had become the capital building of the territory that replaced her kingdom, and it stayed a government office until 1969. Her song, Aloha Oi, written before any of this as a farewell between lovers, turned into the sound of Hawaiian loss and is still played at departures worldwide. In 1993, Congress passed a formal apology for the overthrow. It moved no borders and returned no land. So far, everybody at least agreed a country had been taken. The next two vanished so neatly that the paperwork insisted nothing had been taken at all. Shotai's kingdom was not conquered, not defeated in war, and not annexed by treaty. It was processed. The Japanese term for what happened translates roughly as the Ryukyu disposition, which is a word you use for an estate, not a nation. Stand at Shuri Castle above Naha, and you can see what he had. Painted red, built to a plan that looks like nothing in Japan and nothing in China, because it sat between them and borrowed from both. A court of scholar officials on the Chinese model, investiture ceremonies performed by envoys who sailed in for the purpose, its own trade network across the East China Sea, its own language, its own ritual calendar. In the 1850s, the kingdom signed treaties with the United States, France, and the Netherlands as a sovereign state in its own name. The weakness was the same thing that had kept it alive. For more than 250 years, Ryukyu paid tribute to Qing China and to Japan's Satsuma domain at the same time. Both knew, both tolerated it, because ambiguity was cheaper than a war. The kingdom survived by being slightly owned by everybody and fully owned by nobody. Then Japan modernized and started drawing hard lines. Modern states do not like ambiguity. They like borders, censuses, and lists of who belongs to whom. In 1872, Tokyo unilaterally relabeled the kingdom a domain and handed the king a Japanese noble rank he had not asked for. Then it banned the tribute missions to China. Shotai stalled, sent quiet petitions to Beijing, and waited for the Qing to act. The Qing protested, and protesting was all they could manage. They were losing arguments on every border they had. An American-brokered mediation went nowhere. Japan stopped negotiating. In March 1879, Japanese officials and police arrived at Shuri Castle with an order. The kingdom was abolished. The territory became Okinawa Prefecture. The king was told to move to Tokyo. Now the reversal, and it is not the one you expect. He was not imprisoned, exiled, or paraded. He was made a marquis in Japan's newly invented peerage, given a stipend, and settled in the capital of the state that had erased his own. His descendants kept the rank. The family did fine. The country did not. Some of his officials refused to accept it and fled to China, where they spent years petitioning for restoration. That campaign died in 1895, when Japan defeated the Qing and there was nobody left to petition. In the new prefecture, the Ryukyuan languages were pushed out of schools and the court ritual was left to rot. Shotai died in Tokyo in 1901. A farewell verse is traditionally attributed to him from the day he left. Attributed, not documented, and I would not build anything on it. What survives is stranger than a poem anyway. The royal tombs at Tamauden still stand outside Naha, holding kings of a state that has not appeared on a map for nearly 150 years. Shuri Castle became an army barracks, then a shrine site, then rubble in 1945 during the Battle for Okinawa. It was rebuilt from 1992. In 2019, it burned down again. No government in exile, no serious claimant, no restoration movement. There is a castle that keeps burning, a set of tombs, and a language most of the grandchildren cannot speak. Shotai had 250 years of warning. The next man had about a month. Jamshid bin Abdullah inherited something almost nobody else on this list ever had. A fully independent, internationally recognized country, handed over by Britain with a flag-raising ceremony and a constitution. He ruled it for 33 days. Zanzibar, in December 1963, looked like a serious state. Stone town with its carved doors and the House of Wonders. A palace on the waterfront. A dynasty from Oman that had governed the islands since the early 1800s, from a period when a sultan moved his capital there because the islands were richer than Muscat. Cloves, in quantities that made the place one of the world's dominant suppliers. A royal yacht, a police force, a seat at the United Nations on the way. The weakness was the arrangement underneath all of it. A minority Arab elite governed an African majority whose ancestors that same economy had enslaved. The electoral system had just produced a government dominated by Arab-led parties, even though African-led parties had won more votes. Britain had spent 60 years propping this up. Then Britain packed and left, and took its troops with it. So the Sultan was handed full sovereignty and had his protection removed in the same week. On the 12th of January 1964, armed men came into the town before dawn. The police were thin, poorly armed, and overwhelmed within hours. There was no British battalion to call because the British had gone home a month earlier. The Sultan, his family, and a handful of officials got onto the royal yacht and out to sea. What followed was violent. Estimates of the dead vary widely, and remain politically contested, running into the thousands, mostly Arab and South Asian civilians. Many more fled and never came back. I will not dwell on it, but the country that came out the other side was not the one written into the Constitution. In April, Zanzibar merged with Tanganyika. The union produced Tanzania. Zanzibar had existed as an independent state for 4 months. Now the exile, which is where this one turned strange. Britain, which had guaranteed his throne for decades, initially refused to let him settle there. He was let in eventually, and he ended up in Portsmouth, in ordinary housing, on limited means, for the better part of 50 years. Neighbors knew him as a quiet older man. Most had no idea he had been a head of state. His palace kept working without him. The Sultan's palace in Stone Town is a museum now. The family furniture is still in it. Tourists photograph the throne room and the bedrooms and move on. Nobody in that queue is thinking about a man on the south coast of England waiting for a bus. The twist is what independence actually did to him. Under British protection, with no real sovereignty at all, the dynasty had survived more than a century. Given genuine sovereignty, it lasted a month. The document that made him a proper king is the document that got him removed. He was allowed to return to Oman in 2020 and died in Muscat that October, aged 90. He had outlived his own country by 56 years and spent almost all of them somewhere nobody knew he had ever had one. Every country so far was taken. The next one was handed over, in daylight, by a vote. Palden Thondup Namgyal was the Chogyal of Sikkim, the last of a Buddhist dynasty that had held a Himalayan throne since the 1640s. Chogyal means something close to Dharma king. He had a palace at Gangtok, monasteries under his patronage, his own flag, his own stamps and coins, and a coronation covered by the international press because he had married an American, Hope Cook, who became a magazine story on 2 continents. He also had a treaty with India from 1950 that handled his foreign policy, his defense, and his communications. Sikkim had no army, and its protection came entirely from the country wrapped around it on 3 sides. And it had a demographic problem the palace never solved. The Bhutia and Lepcha communities the monarchy rested on were a minority. Most Sikkimese were of Nepali origin, and the political system gave them less weight than their numbers. That is not a crack you can cover with ceremony. He wanted more. Through the 1960s and early 1970s, he pushed for upgraded status and real international recognition. India, which had watched Tibet absorbed and fought 2 wars in the region, did not see a small Buddhist kingdom when it looked north. It saw a corridor. In 1973, protests over rigged elections gave Delhi its opening. An Indian administrator was installed. A 1974 act reduced the Chogyal to a figurehead. In April 1975, Indian troops disarmed the palace guard and confined him inside the palace. The referendum was held on the 14th of April, 1975. The official result was around 97% in favor of abolishing the monarchy and joining India. Sikkim became India's 22nd state. Critics inside Sikkim and abroad have disputed the conditions the vote was held under. Others point out that the grievances behind it were real and decades old. The argument has never been settled. The rest is short. His marriage had already ended, Hope Cook having left with the children in 1973. His eldest son and heir died in a car crash in 1978. He lost the kingdom, the marriage, and the successor inside 5 years. He kept protesting the annexation's legality until he died of cancer in a New York hospital in 1982, and his body was flown back to Gangtok for Buddhist funeral rites performed for the king of a country that had legally ceased to exist 7 years earlier. Sikkimese stamps are philately now. You can buy a sovereign kingdom's postage online for a few dollars. Every other ruler here can at least say their country was taken from them. He had to live with the possibility that it was voted away. All of them lost one country. The last man lost 2, and the second one was built specifically to give him back a throne. Puyi was made emperor of China at 2 years old, carried into a ceremony he cried through. The forbidden city he inherited was a city. 180 acres, close to 1,000 buildings, and an entire economy of eunuchs, tutors, cooks, and tailors whose jobs existed because he did. Meals arrived as dozens of dishes he did not eat. He was the son of heaven, and he was not allowed outside the walls. He lasted 3 years. The 1911 revolution ended the dynasty, and in February 1912, his regent signed an abdication on his behalf. He was 6. Then came the strangest arrangement on this list. The new republic let him keep the title, the palace, and a stipend under a document called the Articles of Favorable Treatment. For 12 years, there was an emperor of nothing living inside the walls with a working court, eunuchs, and rituals, while a republic ran the country outside. The court had no state. The state had no emperor. Both sides pretended otherwise. In 1924, a warlord tore the agreement up and expelled him from the palace in a matter of hours. He went to the Japanese concession in Tianjin, and that decision cost him whatever was left. In 1932, Japan installed him in Manchuria, first as chief executive, then in 1934 as emperor of Manchukuo, with a coronation, an anthem, a palace, and a court. His ministers reported to the Kwantung Army. He signed what he was handed. Almost no country recognized the state. It lasted 13 years. In August 1945, the Soviets invaded and captured him at an airfield, trying to fly to Japan. He appeared at the Tokyo war crimes trials as a witness for the prosecution, testifying against the people who had put him back on a throne. In 1950, the Soviets handed him to the People's Republic. He spent 9 years at the re-education center at Fushun. He had to be taught to dress himself and tie his own shoelaces because he had never done either. He was pardoned in 1959. And then the last emperor of China went to work as a gardener at the Beijing Botanical Garden and later as an archivist. He published a memoir, From Emperor to Citizen, produced under state supervision, which is worth remembering when you read how thoroughly he condemns himself in it. He married a nurse in 1962. He died of kidney cancer in October 1967, while the Cultural Revolution tore through the country outside his window. There is a story that follows him everywhere, that he once visited the Forbidden City as a paying tourist and corrected a caption in an exhibition about his own family. It gets repeated constantly and sourced thinly. Treat it as the story people want to be true. The documented ending is stranger anyway. He was cremated, and in 1995, his ashes were moved to a commercial cemetery beside the western Qing tombs, where his ancestors lie under imperial mounds with stone animals lining the approach. The last emperor is next door to them, on a plot somebody paid for. What the whole list leaves behind is a set of objects: a grave in Damascus, a mausoleum in a Dutch garden, a church on Madeira with fresh flowers in it, a monastery in Illinois, a burned hill above Antananarivo, a palace in Honolulu with opening hours and a gift shop, a castle in Okinawa that keeps burning down, a throne room in Stonetown full of tourists, stamps from a Himalayan kingdom worth a few dollars. Countries rarely die in battle. They die in a signature, a vote, a merger, a resolution, and the person still holding the title is usually the last one told.